sessions. We're going to do another in our series of features on speakers for the Haven Center. Tonight, Professor Gamson. Professor Gamson, if you could just tell us a little bit about where you hail from and what brought you here to Madison in November tonight.
Well, I hail from Boston College, and I co-direct something there called the Media Research and Action Project, which is a program for working with various grassroots groups on their media communication strategies, groups that are interested in social change.
Now, I'm aware of several attempts to reform the mainstream media. A professor who used to be here, Robert McChesney, has written extensively about how the medium has been commercialized and taken out of the hands of the public and the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Can you talk to us about grassroots media production and where's that going? Where does it need to go?
Well, I know McChesney's work and respect it a lot. I think that's really a media reform effort. We're more like taking the media as it exists, although we would like to see it changed, and teaching groups how to use it, making them aware of journalistic practices, bad habits that journalists have, and basically trying to direct their strategy based on an understanding of how journalists really operate and what their questions are, what they consider newsworthy, what they don't consider newsworthy, and so forth, and various pitfalls that you can easily fall into. So.
Maybe you've probably heard of Stuart Hall with the Open University. He talks a lot about the politics of representation and how people, race, gender are affected. Do you have some work in that area too about representation and what reporters are trying to represent? Or?
Yes, in fact, I like Stuart Hall's work very much, and we've been influenced by the Brits and some of the French too in our work. But essentially, we're trying to apply some of those ideas, teaching them about strategy, basically thinking of media strategically, and recognizing that you can't really divorce media strategy from your more general strategy. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is about framing, the issues of framing and so forth, which is very central to the kinds of stuff that we do. Basically, what's an effective framing strategy for a group?
You had mentioned in particular in our conversation before this interview of the way in which, for example, issues like domestic violence are being framed in the media. In the way you talked about it almost sounded like how lawyers try to frame, if they're defending a person that has been abusive, how they frame the victim of the abuse. Or is that what you mean, or what are some examples?
Well, let me give you an example from the Rhode Island Coalition, which is we've had a long working relationship with them. A typical way that journalists handle issues of domestic violence is they go around and they interview a neighbor, some guy who's just killed his wife and children and then killed himself. And the neighbors say, "Oh, he was such a nice guy. I can't, he must have just flipped because of the economic pressures. I heard he lost his job and so forth." And then it turns out he has a 10-year history with several incidents of wife abuse and so forth. And you don't really get the picture from interviewing the neighbor. And they, essentially working with the Rhode Island Coalition, we developed a set of practices, a manual for journalists. We've had training programs for journalists, getting them to reframe domestic violence as a social problem, look at preventive measures, change hospital practices, for example. I can give you a very telling example that really stuck in my mind. I didn't witness it, but this was reported by one of the participants in the Rhode Island Coalition. She was thrown down the steps by her boyfriend or husband and was unconscious, brought into the hospital. She's lying on a stretcher and with a curtain around her, and it only goes about a foot and a half off the ground. And the doctor's interviewing her, and he says, "What happened?" She said, "I fell down the steps." The doctor says, "Well, you just fell? You weren't pushed or anything like that?" She looks at the doctor. She looks at the boots of the guy who threw her down the steps. She looks back at the doctor and she says, "Of course not." So he says, "Oh, that's all I wanted to hear. I just wanted to make sure," ignoring all the cues that we're giving. Well, you tell the hospitals that you don't, if there's any suspicion of domestic violence, you don't interview the victim in the presence of the potential abuser here. Duh. I mean, it doesn't really take a lot. But we essentially were successful in getting the hospitals to be self-conscious about that. And there are a number of other kinds of examples with the police practices and so forth that make the same point, that you know, there's a lot of unconsciousness in the practices that are used. So it's just kind of increasing awareness. Domestic violence is a relatively easy issue because no one is in favor of it. But there's still a lot of poor practices that take place there.
Just a few remaining questions, and you have a talk to give that we're going to hear and looking forward to. What are some of those issues that you feel the journalists and reporters just don't get right because they're not asking the right questions, or the way it's being framed is not mustering the evidence or the information that's availed to them? What's wrong in particular?
Well, I think there are many issues in which they're ahistorical. I'm going to be doing a workshop tomorrow about the framing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think the most common frame in the media and actually in the public as well is essentially feuding neighbors. This is a spiral of conflict, and each act is a retaliation for the previous act. There is an element of truth in that. I mean, all these frames have some piece of the truth, but that's a very ahistorical frame. It doesn't really get you to understand the kind of underlying social forces that are involved. In this case, I think two national movements that are in conflict with each other. So there's a kind of path of least resistance. Very rarely is there do they take the trouble to kind of provide the underlying understanding of what's going on. So
that gives me one last question. That's a very interesting comment. Is it possible that the problem is that in this age of the soundbite, journalists don't take the time to become historians, or that they're rushing to meet deadline to compete with other commercial firms, or what's the problem?
Well, they can, I mean, I think you have to use shortcuts. You can have sound bites that are conveying a good frame. I mean, you know, two rights in conflict rather than a fight between right and wrong is a sound bite about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's one that suggests an underlying frame. So you can't report news without framing it in some way. So there's no frame-free way of telling a story. So it's really, you know, which frames are the most useful for increasing our understanding. And, you know, that's really one of the issues, especially that I hope to focus on tomorrow, actually, in the workshop I'm doing rather than tonight. But
okay, well, we thank you very much for this interview, and we hope we framed your discussion tonight well, and look forward to hearing it. So thanks, Professor.
That Democrats and progressives could achieve their political vision if only they were more skilled in framing their messages to appeal to mainstream America. So framing, which was a concept that had been around in the social sciences for 20 years or more, been used quite a bit in a lot of analyses, suddenly became no longer an obscure term, but part of the popular vocabulary. And he argued that the right, conservatives, had created a personal connection to policies, for example, unlikely policies to get popular support, such as tax cuts for the wealthy and the idea of small government, by communicating values like personal responsibility and the importance of a strong traditional family rather than big government to solve most social problems. And the Democrats, by implication, should come up with something similarly powerful that would connect their policies with values. Now, Lakoff is a cognitive psychologist, But he, in Don't Think of an Elephant, he wove together insights that were shared not just by cognitive psychologists, but by sociologists, political scientists, communication specialists, a whole interdisciplinary field of people who had been analyzing framing contests for the past 30 years. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for translating and popularizing a broad interdisciplinary consensus on certain points. And I want to hit some of the points where I think he is accurately reflecting an important consensus in which I share with him. The first of these is the idea that facts never speak for themselves. They take on their meaning by being embedded in frames. Now, I have to say a little bit about the concept of frame, because even though it's part of the popular vocabulary by now, there is not necessarily a clear, agreed-upon meaning. And it is a complicated concept. I think of frames as, first of all, and most importantly, thought organizers. They render some facts as relevant and significant and others as irrelevant and trivial. And if you think about the term frame in the English language, there are actually three different meanings, two of which are important and relevant for the concept, the third of which is a little misleading. But the two meanings of frames, both of which I want to maintain in this concept when we're talking about framing issues, are a picture frame, that is, something that puts a boundary around some subject matter, and I think that frames do that as a thought organizer. They spotlight certain things by putting a rim around them, and the things that are inside that rim are highlighted. The things that are outside become invisible. So one meaning of frame is the picture frame. The second meaning is like the frame of a building. You see the walls and so forth, but you don't see the underlying frame. But it's the underlying infrastructure, this notion of an infrastructure organizing idea that holds things together. So some buildings, it's pretty obvious because they're simple rectangular buildings. You can figure out what the frame is. Other buildings, Frank Gehry or some buildings and so forth, you can't necessarily see the frame because what you see are the outer manifestations of it. And you have to infer the frame because it's not necessarily visible. Both of those meanings, I want to maintain and retain those meanings when we talk about frame. The third meaning is to frame as framing somebody like O.J. Simpson was framed, quote, making somebody appear guilty when they're innocent. And actually, most of the framing work that goes on in politics is the opposite of that, making people appear innocent when they're, in fact, guilty. That's a variable aspect of frames. Frames may, some frames may be misleading, some frames may be revealing. So I don't want to include that meaning or include it as a variable element rather than a fixed element. Now, what Lakoff calls attention to, and which I fully agree with, is that framing matters, and the contest is lost at the outset if one allows one's adversaries to define the terms of debate. And that's the meaning, that's what he's implying in the title of Don't Think of an Elephant. When you say don't think of an elephant, the first thing you think of is an elephant. So you're establishing those terms. So the idea is, if you can get people to think of things in a certain way, then they will, the rest of the frame will follow, and you may have lost the contest at the beginning because you're already arguing in unfavorable terms. And it's very easy to get sucked into that, and a lot of politics is about whose frames are going to prevail. I don't think that being self-conscious about framing is necessarily being manipulative. I think that you have to do it. There's no way of presenting political arguments without, in some sense, framing them. So there are more helpful frames and less helpful frames. But the act of framing shouldn't be thought of as negative or manipulative. It gives coherent meaning to what is happening in the world. And you can either do it consciously with deliberation and thought, or what happens a lot of the time unconsciously. Let me give you another example of how framing sort of shapes thinking here. Many of us have been struck by the persistence of the belief that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein are connected. Now, anybody who's read the evidence, you can see there weren't meetings, and it seems like there's overwhelming evidence that there is no connection. But how come if there's no, with all that evidence, there are many voters who still believe that there is a connection? Usually the explanation is that either the media is failing in its responsibility to keep people informed, which is a little hard to argue in this case because there's been plenty of stuff in the media about the lack of connection, or that the voters are lazy and inattentive. But let me give you another explanation of that. There's a frame out there, and it's the frame of the Bush administration, in which terrorism, forces of evil, if you want, is framed as a hydra-headed monster. Okay, this monster represents the forces of evil, and Saddam and Al-Qaeda are two heads of the same monster. So whether or not in that frame, whether or not there was actual meetings by agents or other forms of communication is nitpicking, and it's irrelevant. It's pre-9/11 thinking. And that frame is enough to persuade a lot of people that there's a connection, even though there's no evidence of communication or anything between it. So you're not going to convince people by demonstrating that evidence. You're not going to refute that frame. You have to do it with some kind of alternative frame. You defeat a frame with another frame, not with facts which contradict it. That frame renders those facts irrelevant. So that's one point I think that Lakoff is helpful on. Another point, which I give him credit for, is that people carry around multiple frames in their heads. We don't just have a single way of framing an issue. You can think of it, you've got a series of different, there are a number of frames possible, and maybe they have different probabilities. And some ways of framing it for some people are more easily triggered. There are more cues at getting them to think of, but they can switch. So they can, if they're cued this way or set up this way, they'll frame it this way. Something will break that frame and they can reframe it. So people are shifting back and forth in many cases. And it's easier, it's more useful to think of them as having multiple frames rather than having a single frame. And when you're involved in a framing contest, to recognize that they may be thinking about it one way, but it's not at all impossible to get them to start rethinking and thinking about it a different way. So frame switching is typical. It's not unusual. And that's one of the reasons why there's overwhelming evidence in survey research of how a change in question wording can make for huge shifts. Well, because the way the question is worded triggers a particular frame. And it's always a challenge for people who don't want to stack it in favor of a particular frame to find a way of wording a question so it doesn't trigger a particular frame. Now, there are lots of people there are these pseudo-surveys where people are calling up and they're deliberately putting it in a certain way because they want you to frame it that way, and of course they get the answers that they're looking for. Okay, so people carry around multiple frames, and it's important, because they have multiple frames, to keep the ability to enter into the worldview of one's adversary. And I would give Lakoff credit for not demonizing conservatives. He makes a successful effort to enter into their way of thinking. And we have to do that. If you're going to be successful in a framing contest, you have to be able to kind of look at the world from the standpoint of the frame you're trying to combat, the adversarial frame, the adversary's frame. and to do it in an honest way. That is, the test that we usually have is, if you state a frame that you don't agree with, and you're doing it fairly, then a person who advocates that frame should say, yes, that's what I believe that, that's what I think. Often when you hear someone stating someone else's frame, or I hear someone stating my frame on an issue, I think, that's not what I'm saying at all, that's a caricature of it. So I'm saying it's important to really be able to enter into it in a way that that person would recognize that that is their frame. And that's a step toward being able to counter it in a framing contest. Okay, now I'm going to start into some of the things that I part company with Lakoff on. One of them has to do with the content of the frames that he emphasizes in this Don't Think of an Elephant. He talks about the conservative using a strict father frame, I mean, these family analogies, strict fathers versus nurturing parents. And that conservatives have succeeded with this kind of strict father, tough love kind of frame. And if we can come up with something as appealing as that, progressives can come up with that, then they'll win. This is a silver bullet or a magic bullet through which you can rebuild majority support if only they follow the formula. And I think that appeal of this magic formula was part of Lakoff's initial success here. I'm told that his day has passed, and maybe this talk is a little bit out of date, but I'm not positive of that. So Lakoff reminds us that progressive values such as fairness, inclusiveness, empathy, and community have broad cultural appeal. I think that's definitely true. I think they do have a lot of appeal, and I think maybe we're seeing some of that appeal in this election we're in the midst of right now. So he's saying, if we could just find a way of framing that brings these values, fairness, inclusiveness, empathy, community, to the forefront. Well, yes and no. I think that the family metaphor works much better as a metaframe for conservative thinkers than it does for progressive thinkers. But even for conservatives, there are a lot who, instead of embracing strict father, the strict father frame that he talks about, are instead fearful of Big Brother when they think about the role of government. Conservatives aren't just enamored of a strict father government. They can be frequently alarmed about government. And I think we've seen a number of issues in the last few years where that's true, where you have potential alliances where libertarian conservatives are not happy about wiretaps without warrants and other kinds of intrusions of government getting library records about what people read and so forth. These are not just things that progressives or civil libertarians are concerned about. They're things that libertarian conservatives are concerned about as well. So I'm not sure that strict father is all that successful a metaphor or that all that extensive. It also is not at all clear to me how the strict father model articulates with a free market metaframe. Strict fathers don't have invisible hands. So, you know, that's a central metaphor for the free market. But furthermore, the alternative that he's kind of suggesting, the nurture and parent alternative, which I think is a kind of a soft version of the European-style welfare state that brought us Social Security and federal labor regulation, and the New Deal and so forth, that this resonates differently for those who call themselves liberals and those who call themselves progressives. The nurture and parent metaphor does not really have a lot of relevance for people who see themselves on a quest for social justice, which is what a lot of progressives, including myself, think of themselves as involved in. Not the same as a nurture and parent. Locking arms and singing "We Shall Overcome" is about self-help and interdependence. It's about brotherhood and sisterhood, not parents. So I'm not at all convinced that the nurturant parent contrast with the strict father is a very helpful way of thinking about this framing contest in the country that Lakoff is talking about. And I don't think it's very fruitful. And I would go further with respect to foreign policy issues. Family metaphors are not the most likely frames for most people, I think, at all on foreign policy issues. Lakoff doesn't have much to say at all about another important resonant metaframe. The world is a dangerous place. It was central during the Cold War era. It's reinforced in all sorts of ways in the culture. For example, in cartoons, where you have the superhero who rescues the innocents from unprovoked attacks by evil forces. This is a staple of children's cartoons. This isn't exactly a strict father or nurturing parent, but a benevolent outsider, the superhero, who protects the whole family. So what to do about Osama bin Laden is not really about tough love versus co-counseling. That's not what the issue's about. And I don't see, again, that it's very helpful in understanding the framing of foreign policy issues. Now, let me go on to what I think Lakoff obscures. I'm hoping to leave quite a bit of time for questions, so I think I should be able to finish the rest of this in about 15 or 20 minutes. So, Lakoff directs our attention to the message, but he shifts it away from the groups, the political parties, governments, and other carriers of those messages. So the carriers are obscured, and the complicated and uneven playing field on which they compete is also obscured. Social movements and the advocacy groups that they spawn frequently challenge official or dominant frames. The playing field in which they compete is full of inequalities in power and resources that play a major role in whether they succeed. Some succeed anyway, with not very much in the way of resources, against long odds in reframing political debates. And those successes with a disadvantage on the playing field are really important to analyze. We can analyze their experience and draw lessons from them. And I could give you, lots of examples if we get into that. So it's important to look at the playing field, look at the inequalities in power that they have as part of the analysis of a framing contest. The second point is that he doesn't really embed the framing guides in a broader movement building context. And just occurred to me that I had a handout that you were supposed to bring, Patrick. I don't know whether you remember. You probably didn't, but I'll have to. I wish I had. I don't have a way of projecting it or something, but I'll have to read it or share it. Is there something that I could put on where I could project a document? Okay, I'm not quite ready to show it yet, but I'm getting close to that point because I want to argue that it's important to embed framing guides in a broader movement building context. And in this respect, the absence of the carriers in Lakoff, he is asking us not only to ignore the elephant in the room, but also the moles, ferrets, chipmunks, occasional black panthers, raging bulls, and wild boars, and the more domesticated donkeys and carrier pigeons. There's a whole menagerie out there that Lakoff is not thinking about. Successful challengers integrate their framing strategies with broader movement building strategies. This means building and sustaining the carrier of these frames by, for example, helping groups figure out how to gain access when blocked, how to better collaborate with groups sharing similar goals. This is not about message. This is about the nitty-gritty of coalition building and finding opportunities where this strategy can be more effective than this other one because there are obstacles that the better strategy doesn't have to face or can get around. We're talking about framing concepts as about a lot more than simply staying on message. Lakoff, I think, falls into the pitfalls of the social marketing model. Without a strategy to build a base or constituency, and without democratic media reform, framing can simply become another more sophisticated but still ungrounded variation on the truth will set you free. Well, the truth by itself needs a little help. Framing strategies must not just address the content and/or style of the message, but attend to base building and challenge the contours of the non-level playing field in which the contest is carried on. So the singular focus on finesse in framing undermines the goals of increasing citizens' sense that they can collectively change things. By treating participants as individuals whose citizenship involves voting and perhaps conveying their personal opinions to key decision makers, citizens as collective actors acting together are moved off the screen. And that's my biggest objection and problem with Lakoff. And what my handout was going to do, okay, involves a participatory communication model to promoting frames, looking at the failings of the mass media with an eye on building long-term, ongoing relationships with journalists. It attempts to draw out the latent sense of agency that people carry around with them. The powerlessness that people feel can be gotten beyond. And social movements, the whole history of social movements is people who are feeling powerless suddenly find themselves empowered. What I'm going to do is hand out this participatory communication for social change developed by my colleague Charlotte Ryan on the Media Research and Action Project, MRAP, for those who remember the 60s, and that may have some resonances for you. There was a project in the 60s called ERAP, Education Research and Action Project, which MRAP is sort of playing on. At any rate, I'd like to kind of go through some of these points in the participatory communication model, but let me draw a conclusion first, and then maybe we can turn to that and then open it for questions. The conclusion is framing matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. And there's a danger of quick fix politics. The sexy frame is the new hot button. Second point, integrating framing strategies and other forms of movement building is necessary if the frame carriers are going to be able to compete successfully against the carriers of official frames with lots of resources and organization behind them. And this involves an explicit recognition of power inequalities and how to challenge them, and a recognition of citizens as potential collective actors, not just individual ones. There's a story was circulating on the internet a while back, attributed to Jim France of the Pavilion Hotel Group in Bangkok. It was after the tsunami. The Pavilion Hotel Group in Bangkok had elephant rides, were one of the main attractions at a resort hotel in Phuket. And about 20 minutes before the first wave of the tsunami hit, the 9 elephants who were part of these elephant rides became extremely agitated and unruly. They broke out of their confinement, climbed a nearby hill, and started bellowing. Many people followed them up the hill before the waves hit and survived. After the waves had subsided, the elephants went down the hill as a group and started picking up children with their trunks and running them back up the hill. After the children were taken care of, the elephants started helping the adults. According to the account, they rescued 42 people. they wouldn't let their handlers mount them until the job was done. Now, to make this metaphor fit my message, I'm going to add a detail that didn't actually happen, but act as if it did. Let's imagine that in carrying out their rescue mission, the elephants confronted a group of government soldiers assembled to enforce a law against elephants acting as a pack. And imagine further that these 9 elephants just ran right through and over the soldiers, brushing them aside to complete their mission. Now, there are some elephants to think about. Okay. Now, I don't know how to sort of get these points, these 10 points that characterize framing strategies, since we don't have the handout, but maybe I will take the time to read them to you. These are framing strategies that are carried out from this alternative model that we're advocating, this participatory communication model. And I say they're drawn up by my colleague, Charlotte Ryan, who co-directs this project. 1, framing strategies must be historically and socially embedded, acknowledging both historical and present inequalities of power, as well as historical and present traditions of resistance and the social networks that sustain them. 2, framing strategies cannot be reduced to individual debate tactics. Rather, they represent political dialogues with targeted constituencies. 3, generally speaking, individuals can oppose and resist but not change systems relations. To overcome structural inequalities, therefore, marginalized groups, those directly affected, form collective actors. 4, frames imposed externally by experts or elite decision makers may have short-term impact but can weaken movement building. Collective actors representing marginalized groups must be at the center of decision making. Learning and movement building happens as frames are forged and dialogues develop. Work with experts must be collaborative. 5, building on shared values, for example, respect, diversity, and equality, collective actors establish participatory processes for negotiating priorities and resolving conflicts. These permit transparency, reflexivity, and accountability in decision making. Messaging work happens in this context. 6, collective actors develop a vision and mission from which strategy flows. 7, in choosing strategy, collective actors match the historical conditions to their resources, a concrete analysis of existing conditions. Work plans break long-term goals into incremental steps. 8, because it takes time and resources to change structures, movements must build infrastructure and systems that allow for reflection and shifts in strategies. With reflection part of routine, group measures results and makes adjustment. 9, democratic organizational practices are transformative. That is, they embody prefigurative politics. That the long-term goals are visible in the daily routines and practices that resist existing structural inequalities. Participants experience the collective actor as a relatively free or safe space. 10, coalition building is a framing exercise. Coalitions build relations by a dialogue and shared common projects. Coalition contact is guided by same values of respect, equality, and diversity. So these are some of the central principles of this alternative participative communication model. So let me stop there and open it for questions.